The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training range as Commander Jake Morrison stepped out of his vehicle. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the valley, a familiar symphony that had become the soundtrack to his military career. At 42, Morrison had seen more combat zones than he cared to remember, and his weathered face told stories of countless missions where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. Today was supposed to be routine. The Navy SEAL training facility was hosting an inter-service marksmanship competition, bringing together elite shooters from different branches of the military. Morrison had organized these events before, and they usually followed a predictable pattern. The best snipers would show off their skills, friendly rivalries would emerge, and, by the end of the day, everyone would head to the bar to share war stories. What Morrison didn't expect was the quiet young woman standing at the edge of the firing line, adjusting the scope on a rifle that looked almost too big for her small frame. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had arrived early, as she always did. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to let her actions speak louder than her words. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform was pressed to perfection. But it was her eyes that caught attention, sharp, focused, and holding secrets that most people would never guess. Maria had grown up in a small town in Texas where her father ran a struggling ranch. Money was always tight, and when the bank threatened foreclosure, her family faced a choice that would change everything. Her older brother had already enlisted in the army, sending money home whenever he could. But it wasn't enough. That's when Maria discovered she had a gift. Her grandfather had been a hunter, and he'd taught her to shoot when she was just 10 years old. What started as weekend trips to hunt deer for the family table became something much more significant. Maria found that when she looked through a rifle scope, the world made sense in a way it never did anywhere else. The chaos of her family's financial struggles, the pressure of being the only girl in a house full of men, the uncertainty of what her future would hold, all of it disappeared when she focused on a target hundreds of yards away. By the time she was 16, Maria could hit a target at distances that impressed even the most experienced hunters in her area. But she kept this skill mostly to herself, knowing that in her traditional family, shooting was considered a man's domain. Her father was proud of her ability, but he also worried about what people would think. The financial crisis came to a head during Maria's senior year of high school. The bank was ready to foreclose, and her family was facing the loss of everything they'd worked for. That's when Maria made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She walked into the Army recruiting office and asked about becoming a sniper. The recruiter, Sergeant First Class Robert Chen, had been in the Army for 15 years and thought he'd heard every story there was to hear. Young people came to his office with dreams of glory, adventure, or simply a steady paycheck. But Maria Santos was different. She didn't talk about wanting to serve her country or see the world. She was direct and honest about her situation. "My family is about to lose our ranch," she told him. "I can shoot better than anyone I know, and I need a job that pays well enough to help them keep it." Chen was skeptical. He'd met plenty of young people who claimed to be good shots, but most of them had learned to shoot at video games or had fired a few rounds at a local range. When he asked Maria about her experience, she simply said, "Give me a test." The next day, Chen took Maria to a local shooting range. He set up targets at various distances and handed her a rifle similar to what she'd be using in the military. What happened next changed the course of both their lives. Maria's first shot was a perfect bullseye at 200 yards. Her second shot was the same. Chen moved the targets further back, 300 yards, 400, 500. Each time, Maria adjusted for wind and distance with the instinct of someone who had been doing this her entire life. By the time she was hitting targets at 800 yards with consistency that would make experienced snipers jealous, Chen knew he was looking at something special. But the military in 2018 was still adjusting to the idea of women in combat roles. When Maria arrived at basic training, she faced skepticism from instructors and fellow soldiers who couldn't believe that this quiet young woman could outshoot men who had been training for years. Some of them made jokes about her being there just to meet the military's diversity requirements. Others assumed she was all talk and no skill. Maria let them think what they wanted. She had learned long ago that proving doubters wrong was more effective than arguing with them. During her first marksmanship qualification, she set a new record for her training company. During advanced individual training, she broke the course record that had stood for 6 years. By the time she graduated from sniper school, her instructors were calling her the most naturally gifted marksman they had ever seen. But natural talent was only part of Maria's story. The other part was the pressure she carried every day, knowing that her family's future depended on her success. Every paycheck she sent home helped keep the ranch afloat. Every promotion meant a raise that could help her parents make improvements to the property. The weight of that responsibility never left her shoulders, but it also drove her to excel in ways that surprised even her. Now, 5 years later, Maria stood at the firing line of one of the most prestigious shooting competitions in the military. She had volunteered for this event not because she wanted recognition, but because winning came with a cash prize that could finally pay off the remaining debt on her family's ranch. Commander Morrison approached the firing line, checking in with the various competitors. He knew most of them by reputation: Staff Sergeant Williams from the Army Rangers, who had completed 3 tours in Afghanistan; Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez from the Marines, who held the record for the longest confirmed kill by a Marine sniper; Petty Officer Johnson from the Navy SEALs, who had trained under some of the most legendary snipers in military history. When Morrison reached Maria, he paused. He had read her file and knew about her impressive record, but seeing her in person, he couldn't help but wonder if the reports were exaggerated. She looked so young, so small compared to the other competitors. Most of the men on the line were at least 6 feet tall and built like the athletes they were. Maria stood barely 5 feet 4 inches and couldn't weigh more than 130 pounds. "Staff Sergeant Santos," Morrison said, extending his hand. "I've heard good things about your shooting." Maria shook his hand firmly and looked him directly in the eye. "Thank you, sir. I'm ready to do my best today." There was something in her voice, a quiet confidence that didn't come from arrogance but from experience. Morrison found himself curious to see what this young woman could do. The first event was a standard precision shooting test at 500 yards. Each competitor would fire 10 rounds at a target, and points would be awarded based on accuracy. It was designed to eliminate the weaker shooters and identify the top performers who would advance to more challenging stages. Maria waited her turn, watching the other competitors take their shots. Staff Sergeant Williams went first, placing 8 of his 10 rounds in the bullseye and scoring 94 out of a possible 100 points. The crowd of observers, other military personnel who had come to watch the competition, applauded respectfully. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez stepped up next, taking his time to study the wind conditions and adjust his scope. His shots were methodical and precise, and when the scoring was announced, he had achieved 96 points. The crowd grew more enthusiastic, sensing that this was going to be a competitive event. Petty Officer Johnson, representing the Navy SEALs, approached his shooting position with the swagger that SEALs were known for. He had won this competition 2 years ago and was confident he could do it again. His shooting was smooth and professional, and he also scored 96 points, tying with Rodriguez. Several other competitors took their turns, with scores ranging from 88 to 95 points. The atmosphere was friendly but competitive, with each shooter trying to outdo the others while maintaining the professional respect that existed between elite military personnel. Finally, it was Maria's turn. As she approached the firing line, the conversation among the observers grew quieter. Many of them had never seen a female sniper compete at this level, and they were curious to see how she would perform. Some were genuinely interested in her skills, while others were skeptical about whether she belonged in this company. Maria set up her position with the same methodical approach she used for everything. She checked her rifle, adjusted her scope for the current conditions, and studied the wind flags that would affect her shots. Her movements were efficient and practiced, showing none of the nervousness that might be expected from someone competing in such a high-level event for the first time. Commander Morrison watched from the side, studying Maria's technique. He had seen thousands of shooters over his career, and he could usually tell within the first few seconds whether someone really knew what they were doing. Maria's setup was textbook perfect: her body position, the way she held the rifle, the methodical way she prepared for each shot. But what impressed him most was her breathing. Even from several feet away, he could see that she had the kind of respiratory control that came from years of practice. Maria chambered her first round and settled into her shooting position. The range fell completely silent as she aimed downrange at the target that was barely visible to the naked eye. Through her scope, she could see the black bullseye clearly, and she began the mental calculation that had become second nature to her over the years. Wind speed was about 5 miles per hour from the left. Temperature was 78 degrees. Humidity was moderate. Distance was exactly 500 yards. She had fired this exact shot thousands of times in training and combat, and her muscle memory took over as she controlled her breathing and began to squeeze the trigger. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the range. Maria remained motionless for a moment, following through with her shot as she had been trained to do. Then, she chambered another round and repeated the process. Shot after shot, Maria's technique remained exactly the same. Her breathing was controlled, her movements were minimal, and her focus was absolute. To the observers, it looked almost mechanical, as if she was a machine designed specifically for precision shooting. When she fired her 10th and final shot, Maria remained in position for several seconds before finally sitting up and clearing her rifle. She had shown no emotion during the entire string of fire, maintaining the same calm expression that she had worn when she first arrived at the range. The range safety officer called for the targets to be scored. As the scorer walked down range to examine Maria's target, Commander Morrison found himself holding his breath. He had been watching her shooting position and technique, and everything had looked perfect. But he had seen skilled shooters have bad days, and he knew that marksmanship competitions could be unpredictable. The scorer reached Maria's target and stopped. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked back toward the firing line. He examined the target again, counting the holes and measuring their position relative to the center of the bullseye. Staff Sergeant Santos, the scorer called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet range. Perfect score. 100 points. The silence that followed was complete. Everyone on the range, competitors, observers, range personnel, stood frozen for a moment as they processed what they had just heard. A perfect score at 500 yards was extremely rare, even among the best military shooters. Many of the observers had never seen one achieved in competition. Commander Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. In 20 years of organizing and participating in shooting competitions, he had seen only 3 perfect scores at this distance. 2 of them had been achieved by snipers with more than 15 years of experience and multiple combat deployments. The third had been achieved by an Olympic shooter who was competing as a guest. Now he was looking at a 28-year-old staff sergeant who had just accomplished the same feat with the calm efficiency of someone who did this every day. The spell was broken when Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez started clapping. "Outstanding shooting, Staff Sergeant," he called out, and the rest of the observers joined in with enthusiastic applause. Maria nodded politely and began cleaning her rifle, showing the same calm demeanor she had maintained throughout the entire event. But Commander Morrison noticed something that others might have missed: the slight relaxation of her shoulders, the barely perceptible smile that crossed her face for just a moment before she regained her composure. As the first event concluded and competitors prepared for the next stage, Morrison found himself approaching Maria again. He needed to understand what he had just witnessed. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "that was some impressive shooting. How long have you been competing at this level?" Maria looked up from cleaning her rifle. "This is actually my first major competition, sir. I mostly just train and do my job." Morrison stared at her for a moment. "Your first competition? You just shot a perfect score in your first major competition?" "Yes, sir. I suppose I did." The simplicity of her response struck Morrison as either remarkable humility or complete confidence. He wasn't sure which, but he was certain that he was looking at something special. As word of Maria's perfect score spread among the observers, the atmosphere of the competition began to shift. What had started as a friendly rivalry between known competitors was now focused on the quiet young woman who had just announced herself as a serious contender. Some of the other competitors approached Maria to congratulate her on her shooting. Their reactions varied. Some were genuinely impressed and curious about her background, while others seemed to be studying her, trying to figure out if her perfect score was skill or luck. Staff Sergeant Williams, the Army Ranger who had scored 94 points, stopped by Maria's position. "Hell of a first shot," he said with a grin. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "Texas," Maria replied simply. Williams laughed. "Well, that explains it. You Texas shooters don't mess around." Petty Officer Johnson, the SEAL who had won this competition before, was less friendly in his approach. He stood nearby, not saying anything but clearly observing Maria's equipment and technique. Morrison could tell that Johnson was trying to find some explanation for her performance that didn't involve accepting that she was simply that good. The second event was announced: precision shooting at 800 yards with crosswind conditions. This was designed to separate the good shooters from the truly exceptional ones. At this distance, factors like wind drift, bullet drop, and atmospheric conditions became much more significant. Even small errors in calculation or technique could result in missed targets. Maria listened to the event description with the same calm attention she had shown all day. 800 yards with crosswind was actually one of her favorite shooting scenarios. It required the kind of complex mental calculation that engaged her mind fully and reminded her why she had fallen in love with precision shooting in the first place. As the competitors prepared for the second event, Commander Morrison found himself watching Maria more carefully. He had organized dozens of these competitions, and he had developed an instinct for identifying the shooters who would surprise everyone. But Maria Santos was beyond anything he had ever seen. What Morrison didn't know was that he was watching someone who had learned to shoot not as a hobby or even as a profession, but as a means of survival for her family. Every shot Maria fired carried the weight of her parents' dreams, her siblings' futures, and her own determination to prove that a young woman from rural Texas could compete with anyone in the world. The range officer began calling competitors to the firing line for the second event. The wind had picked up since the first round, and flags along the range showed variable conditions that would challenge even experienced shooters. This was where the competition would really begin to separate the contenders from the pretenders. Maria watched the wind flags carefully, noting how the wind speed and direction changed at different points along the 800-yard range. She had learned to read wind conditions on her grandfather's ranch, where understanding weather patterns was essential for successful hunting. That childhood education was about to be put to the test in front of some of the best military shooters in the country. As she prepared for her second round of shooting, Maria thought briefly about her family back in Texas. Her father would be checking cattle about now, and her mother would be preparing dinner in the kitchen of the ranch house that had been in their family for 3 generations. They didn't fully understand what their daughter did in the military, but they knew she was good at it, and they were proud of her success. What they didn't know was that their daughter was about to shock the entire military marksmanship community with a display of shooting skill that would be talked about for years to come. The 800-yard line presented a completely different challenge from the 500-yard event. Commander Morrison stood behind the firing positions, watching as each competitor studied the wind conditions and made their calculations. The crosswind was gusting between 8 and 12 miles per hour, with occasional lulls that could trick an inexperienced shooter into misjudging their holdover. Staff Sergeant Williams took the first position again, spending nearly 5 minutes studying the wind flags and taking practice aim before firing his first shot. His experience showed as he compensated for the challenging conditions, but the increased distance and wind took their toll. His first shot struck just outside the bullseye, followed by 8 more shots that grouped well but didn't achieve the precision of his 500-yard performance. His final score was 89 points, still excellent, but not quite at the level he had hoped for. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez approached the line with visible concern. The wind conditions were particularly challenging for his shooting style, which relied on rapid, instinctive shooting rather than lengthy calculation. He fired his string more quickly than Williams had, but several of his shots were affected by wind changes he hadn't anticipated. His final score of 86 points put him behind Williams and clearly frustrated the experienced Marine. Petty Officer Johnson, the defending champion, knew that these conditions played to his strengths. SEALs trained extensively in variable wind conditions, and he had won competitions before by excelling in the more challenging events while other shooters struggled. He took his time, carefully noting each wind change and adjusting his point of aim accordingly. His methodical approach paid off with a score of 91 points, putting him in the lead after 2 events. Several other competitors fired with mixed results. The 800-yard crosswind event was proving to be exactly what the organizers had intended, a separator that would identify the top tier of shooters. Scores ranged from 78 to 91 points, with most competitors falling somewhere in the middle as they struggled with the challenging conditions. Finally, Maria's turn arrived. She approached the firing line with the same calm demeanor she had shown all day, but Commander Morrison noticed that she spent more time than usual studying the range conditions. She watched the wind flags at various distances, noting how the wind patterns changed as they moved downrange. She observed the mirage rising from the heated ground, using it to gauge wind speed and direction at different points along the bullet's path. What the observers didn't know was that Maria had grown up reading wind patterns as a matter of survival. On her family's ranch, understanding weather conditions meant the difference between a successful hunt that would feed the family for weeks and going hungry. Her grandfather had taught her to observe everything: the way grass moved, how dust patterns formed, the behavior of insects and birds, all of which could provide clues about wind conditions that wouldn't show up on any instrument. Maria settled into her shooting position and began her mental calculations. At 800 yards, her bullet would be in flight for approximately 1 second. During that time, a 10-mile-per-hour crosswind would push the bullet approximately 8 inches to the side. But the wind wasn't constant, it was gusting and variable, which meant she needed to time her shots for the moments when conditions were most favorable. She chambered her first round and settled her scope's crosshairs on the target. Through the scope, she could see the heat mirage dancing around the target, indicating the wind conditions at that distance. She waited, breathing steadily, until she sensed a lull in the wind pattern. Then, she fired. The shot felt perfect as it left the barrel. Maria remained motionless, following through as she had been trained, but she already knew the bullet had found its mark. She chambered her second round and began the process again. Shot after shot, Maria demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to read the wind conditions. She seemed to fire during lulls that other shooters hadn't even noticed, and her timing was so precise that observers began to wonder if she was getting information about wind patterns that they couldn't detect. Commander Morrison found himself studying Maria's technique more closely. He had been a competitive shooter himself and understood the complexity of what she was attempting. Reading wind at 800 yards was as much art as science, requiring intuition and experience that usually took years to develop. Yet this young staff sergeant was performing at a level that suggested decades of experience. What Morrison was witnessing was the result of a childhood spent learning to survive in harsh conditions. Maria had learned to read wind not from books or instructors, but from necessity. When your family's next meal depended on making a difficult shot in challenging conditions, you developed skills that couldn't be taught in any military training program. Maria fired her 10th and final shot, then cleared her rifle and remained in position while the scorer walked downrange. The range had grown quiet again as observers realized they might be witnessing something unprecedented. A perfect score at 500 yards was rare. A perfect score at 800 yards in crosswind conditions was nearly unheard of. The scorer reached Maria's target and stopped abruptly. He examined the target carefully, counting holes and measuring their positions relative to the center of the bullseye. He looked back toward the firing line, then at the target again, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Staff Sergeant Santos, the scorer, called out, his voice carrying clearly across the silent range. Perfect score. 100 points. The silence that followed was even more complete than after the first event. 2 perfect scores in a row, with the second coming in conditions that had challenged every other competitor, was beyond what anyone had expected to see. Commander Morrison felt his hands trembling slightly as he processed what had just happened. In his entire military career, he had never seen anyone shoot 2 consecutive perfect scores in competition. He had read about such performances in historical accounts, but he had always assumed the stories were exaggerated over time. Now he was standing 20 feet away from a young woman who had just accomplished something that would become legend in military marksmanship circles. And she was acting as if it was the most natural thing in the world. The applause that erupted from the observers was thunderous. Even the competitors who were now trailing far behind joined in, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. But Maria simply nodded politely, began cleaning her rifle, and prepared for the next event with the same calm professionalism she had shown all day. Staff Sergeant Williams approached Maria's position, shaking his head in amazement. 2 perfect scores, he said. I've been shooting competitively for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like that. Thank you, Maria replied simply. The conditions were actually pretty favorable once you learned to read them. Williams laughed. Favorable? That crosswind was driving everyone crazy except you. Where did you learn to read wind like that? Hunting with my grandfather, Maria said. He taught me that if you can't read the wind, you can't make the shot. The simple honesty of her response struck Williams as remarkable. Most elite shooters would have talked about their training, their equipment, or their technique. Maria attributed her success to lessons learned as a child from her grandfather. There was something both humble and profound about that perspective. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez joined the conversation, his earlier frustration replaced by genuine curiosity. Santos, I've got to ask, what's your background? I mean, where did you train before the military? I didn't really train anywhere formal, Maria replied. Just shooting on the ranch with family. Rodriguez stared at her for a moment. You're telling me you learned to shoot like this just hunting on a ranch? No formal coaching, no competitive shooting background? That's right. And this is your first major competition? Yes, sir. Rodriguez looked at Williams, then back at Maria. That's impossible. Nobody shoots 2 perfect scores in their first competition without years of formal training. Maria continued cleaning her rifle, not responding to Rodriguez's disbelief. She had heard similar comments throughout her military career. People had trouble accepting that someone could achieve this level of skill without following the traditional path of formal instruction and competitive experience. What they didn't understand was that Maria had been competing her entire life, not against other shooters, but against hunger, poverty, and the constant pressure of needing to succeed for her family's survival. Every shot she had fired since childhood carried real consequences that were far more significant than any competition score. Petty Officer Johnson approached the group, his expression serious. As the defending champion, he was now trailing significantly behind Maria, and his confidence was beginning to show cracks. Santos, he said, you've got some serious skills. What unit are you with? I'm currently assigned to the 82nd Airborne, Maria replied. Johnson nodded. Sniper platoon? Reconnaissance. This answer surprised several of the listeners. Reconnaissance units had snipers, but they weren't typically the same elite specialized units that produced competition-level marksmen. The fact that Maria was achieving these scores while assigned to a standard reconnaissance unit rather than a dedicated sniper school or special operations unit made her performance even more remarkable. Commander Morrison had been listening to the conversation while reviewing the scores from the first 2 events. Maria's perfect scores put her significantly ahead of the field, but there were still several events remaining. He knew from experience that competitions could change quickly, and even the best shooters could have bad moments. But what worried Morrison wasn't Maria's shooting, it was the reaction of some of the other competitors. He could see that several of them were struggling to accept what they were witnessing. In the military, there was often an unspoken assumption that the most elite units produced the best shooters. The idea that someone from a standard unit could outperform special operations personnel challenged beliefs that some people weren't ready to question. The third event was announced, long-range precision shooting at 1,000 yards with no wind flags. Competitors would have to read wind conditions using only natural indicators like mirage, vegetation movement, and their own experience. This event was designed to identify shooters who had developed advanced wind reading skills and could perform under conditions that simulated real-world sniping scenarios. At 1,000 yards, the challenges multiplied exponentially. Bullet drop became more significant, atmospheric conditions had greater effects, and even small errors in wind calculation could result in complete misses. Many military snipers rarely shot at distances beyond 800 yards in training, making this event a true test of advanced skills. Maria listened to the event description with increased interest. 1,000-yard shooting had been her passion since her teenage years, when she had started pushing the limits of what was possible with her grandfather's old hunting rifle. The family ranch had areas where she could shoot at distances up to 1,200 yards, and she had spent countless hours learning to make shots that most people would consider impossible. What Maria had discovered during those years of experimentation was that shooting at extreme distances required a completely different mindset. You couldn't rely on the same techniques that worked at shorter ranges. Instead, you had to develop an intuitive understanding of how your rifle, ammunition, and environmental conditions interacted across long distances. As competitors prepared for the 1,000-yard event, the atmosphere on the range grew more intense. This was where reputations were made or broken. Shooters who had dominated at shorter distances sometimes struggled with the additional complexity of extreme long-range shooting, while others who seemed average at 500 or 800 yards suddenly excelled when the distance increased. Staff Sergeant Williams was clearly nervous as he prepared for his turn. He had performed well at the shorter distances, but he knew that 1,000 yards was where his limitations would be exposed. He spent extensive time studying the range, looking for any indicators that might help him judge wind conditions without the benefit of flags. His shooting reflected his uncertainty. Williams fired carefully and methodically, but several of his shots showed the effects of wind miscalculation. His final score of 82 points was respectable but clearly disappointed him. As he left the firing line, he shook his head in frustration, knowing that this event had likely ended his chances of winning the competition.
Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez approached the 1,000-yard line with grim determination. He knew that his scores in the first two events had put him behind, and he needed a strong performance to stay competitive. But the lack of wind flags clearly bothered him, and his shots reflected his struggle to read conditions accurately. His score of 79 points confirmed his fears that this would not be his day. Petty Officer Johnson, still leading among the other competitors, knew that this event represented his best chance to close the gap with Maria. SEALs trained extensively at long range, and he had experience shooting at 1,000 yards in various conditions. He approached the firing line with confidence, taking time to study the range carefully before beginning his string of fire. Johnson's experience showed in his shooting technique. He used mirage patterns and vegetation movement to gauge wind conditions, and his shots were carefully timed to take advantage of favorable moments. His methodical approach paid off with a score of 88 points, his best performance of the day and proof that he belonged among the top tier of military shooters. Several other competitors fired with mixed results, but none achieved scores above 85 points. The 1,000-yard event was proving to be exactly what organizers had intended, an ultimate test that separated good shooters from truly exceptional ones. Finally, Maria was called to the firing line. As she approached her shooting position, Commander Morrison noticed that she seemed more focused than she had been for the previous events. She spent several minutes studying the range, not just looking at obvious indicators like grass movement, but observing subtle signs that most people would never notice. Maria watched the heat mirage rising from different sections of the range, noting how the patterns varied with wind speed and direction. She observed the movement of insects flying across the range, using them to gauge wind conditions at different altitudes. She even studied the way dust patterns formed around the target areas, gathering information that would help her predict bullet behavior across the 1,000-yard distance. What the observers were witnessing was the application of skills that had been developed through years of necessity. On the family ranch, reading wind conditions at long range had meant the difference between bringing home meat for the family and going hungry. Maria had learned to use every available indicator because there were no second chances when your family's next meal depended on your shooting. She settled into her shooting position and began her calculations. At 1,000 yards, her bullet would be in flight for approximately 1.3 seconds. During that time, wind conditions could change multiple times, requiring her to predict not just current conditions but how they might shift during the bullet's flight time. Maria chambered her first round and settled her scope on the target. Through the powerful magnification, she could see the target clearly, but she could also see the complex wind patterns that were affecting the area around it. She waited, breathing steadily, until she sensed that all the indicators were aligned for a successful shot. Her first shot broke cleanly, and she knew immediately that it had found its mark. She chambered her second round and began the process again, each shot requiring the same level of calculation and timing as the first. As Maria continued her string of fire, observers began to notice something remarkable. Her shot seemed to be timed perfectly with wind conditions that were invisible to everyone else. She would wait motionless for several seconds, then fire during moments when the wind patterns suddenly aligned in her favor. Commander Morrison found himself holding his breath as he watched Maria's performance. He had seen exceptional shooting before, but this was different. Maria wasn't just hitting the target, she was demonstrating a level of wind-reading ability that suggested an almost supernatural understanding of atmospheric conditions. Maria fired her 10th and final shot, then remained in position while the scorer walked the long distance to her target. The range had grown completely silent as everyone waited for the results that would either confirm Maria's extraordinary ability or reveal that even she had limitations. The scorer reached Maria's target and examined it carefully. He counted the holes, measured their positions, and double-checked his measurements. Then, he looked back toward the firing line with an expression of complete disbelief. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he called out, his voice carrying across the silent range. "Perfect score. 100 points." The silence that followed was profound. 3 perfect scores in a row, including one at 1,000 yards without wind flags, was beyond what anyone had thought possible. Several observers actually took steps backward, as if they needed physical distance to process what they had just witnessed. Commander Morrison felt his worldview shifting as he stared at the young woman who was calmly cleaning her rifle after accomplishing something that would be remembered as one of the greatest shooting performances in military history. He realized he was witnessing not just exceptional marksmanship, but the emergence of a shooter whose abilities transcended normal human limitations.
The news of Maria's third consecutive perfect score spread through the range like wildfire. Military personnel who had been watching other activities stopped what they were doing and made their way to the marksmanship competition area. Word was spreading through text messages and radio calls that something unprecedented was happening, and people wanted to witness it firsthand. Commander Morrison found himself in the surreal position of having to maintain order and focus on the remaining events while processing what he had just witnessed. 3 perfect scores in increasingly difficult conditions wasn't just exceptional shooting, it was a performance that challenged everything he thought he knew about human marksmanship capabilities. As Maria prepared her equipment for the 4th and final event, Morrison approached her position. He needed to understand what he was witnessing, not just as the competition organizer, but as someone who had spent his entire adult life around elite military personnel. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Maria looked up from her rifle maintenance, her expression calm and attentive. "Yes, sir? In your entire shooting career, military and civilian combined, have you ever missed a target at these distances?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Morrison wasn't sure what answer he expected, but he needed to know if what he was witnessing was normal for Maria or if she was having an exceptional day that happened to coincide with the most important competition of the year. Maria considered the question carefully before responding. "I've missed targets before, sir. Usually when I was learning new distances or trying out different equipment. But once I understand the conditions and have my rifle properly zeroed, missing becomes pretty rare." "How rare?" "I honestly can't remember the last time I missed a shot at these distances under normal conditions." Morrison stared at her for a moment, trying to process this information. "Santos, do you understand what you've accomplished here today? 3 perfect scores at increasing distances with increasingly difficult conditions, that's never been done before in any military competition I know of." "I understand that it's unusual, sir. But the conditions today have been pretty good for shooting, and I've had time to properly prepare for each event." The matter-of-fact way Maria discussed her performance struck Morrison as either remarkable humility or complete confidence. He couldn't decide which, but he was beginning to understand that he was dealing with someone whose shooting abilities existed in a category all their own. The 4th and final event was announced: moving target engagement at 600 yards. A human silhouette target would move across a 100-yard span at variable speeds, requiring shooters to calculate not just wind and distance, but also target movement and timing. This event was designed to simulate real-world sniping scenarios where targets rarely remain stationary. This was the event that most competitors feared. Moving target engagement required split-second decisions, complex calculations performed under time pressure, and shooting skills that went far beyond static target marksmanship. Even experienced military snipers often struggled with moving targets, especially at 600-yard distances where timing had to be perfect. The target system was sophisticated, using a motorized track that could vary the target's speed and direction in unpredictable patterns. Competitors would have 60 seconds to engage the target as many times as possible, with points awarded based on accuracy and the number of hits achieved. Staff Sergeant Williams approached the final event with visible nervousness. Moving targets had never been his strength, and he knew that his chances of placing well in the overall competition depended on a strong performance here. He studied the target system carefully, trying to predict its movement patterns and plan his engagement strategy. When the target began moving, Williams fired his first shot quickly, trying to establish a rhythm. The shot missed, passing behind the target as it moved faster than he had anticipated. His second shot was better, hitting the target but outside the higher scoring zones. He managed to hit the target 4 more times during his 60 seconds, but his accuracy suffered as he rushed to engage the rapidly moving silhouette. Williams' final score for the event was 52 points out of a possible 100. He left the firing line clearly disappointed, knowing that the moving target event had exposed limitations in his skill set that the static events hadn't revealed. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez approached the moving target event with grim determination. He knew his overall scores were already too low to win the competition, but he wanted to finish strong and prove that he belonged among elite military marksmen. Marines trained extensively with moving targets, and he hoped this event would play to his strengths. Rodriguez's approach was more aggressive than Williams had been. He fired rapidly, trying to achieve a high volume of hits rather than focusing on precision. His strategy partially worked. He hit the target 8 times during his 60 seconds, but most of his hits were in the lower scoring areas of the silhouette. His final score of 61 points was better than Williams, but still well below what he had hoped to achieve. Petty Officer Johnson, still leading among the other competitors, knew that this event represented his final opportunity to distinguish himself. SEALs trained extensively with moving targets, and he had personal experience engaging moving enemies in combat situations. He approached the firing line with confidence, planning to use his real-world experience to overcome the artificial challenge of the competition.
Johnson's technique was methodical and professional.
He took time to study the target's movement pattern before engaging, then fired measured shots that demonstrated his experience with dynamic shooting scenarios. He achieved 7 hits during his 60 seconds, but his accuracy was exceptional. 6 of his 7 hits were in the highest scoring zones of the target. Johnson's final score of 84 points was by far the best performance in the moving target event so far. As he left the firing line, he allowed himself a small smile. He knew he couldn't win the overall competition given Maria's perfect scores in the first 3 events, but he had proven that he could perform at the highest level when conditions favored his particular skills. Several other competitors attempted the moving target event with mixed results. Most struggled with the timing required to engage a target moving at variable speeds across a 600-yard distance. Scores ranged from 31 to 67 points, confirming that this was indeed the most challenging event of the competition. Finally, Maria was called to attempt the moving target event. As she approached the firing line, the crowd of observers had grown to more than 100 people. Word of her performance had spread throughout the base, and military personnel from various units had come to witness what many were already calling the greatest shooting performance in military history. Commander Morrison stood behind Maria as she prepared for the final event. He found himself hoping that she would finally show some limitation, not because he wanted her to fail, but because what he had witnessed challenged his understanding of what was humanly possible.
A perfect score on moving targets would complete a performance that belonged in the realm of legend rather than reality.
Maria studied the target system carefully, watching several complete cycles to understand its movement patterns. Unlike the static events, where she had seemed almost casual in her preparation, she now showed intense focus and concentration. She understood that moving targets required different skills from static shooting, and she was adapting her approach accordingly. What the observers didn't know was that Maria had extensive experience with moving targets from her childhood hunting expeditions. Running deer, flying birds, and other moving game had taught her to calculate not just where a target was, but where it would be when her bullet arrived. She had developed an instinctive understanding of lead times and movement prediction that came from years of necessity. When the target began moving, Maria didn't fire immediately. She watched it complete one full cycle, timing its movement and noting the variable speeds. Then, she settled into her shooting position and began engaging with methodical precision. Her first shot hit the target in the center of the highest scoring zone as it moved at full speed across the 600-yard distance. She cycled her bolt smoothly and fired again, hitting the target in nearly the same location as it changed direction. Shot after shot, Maria demonstrated an ability to predict target movement that seemed to transcend normal human reaction time. The observers watched in stunned silence as Maria engaged the moving target with the same mechanical precision she had shown with static targets. Her shooting rhythm was steady and controlled, with each shot carefully timed to intercept the target at the optimal moment. She seemed to know exactly where the target would be seconds before it arrived there. As her 60 seconds expired, Maria had fired 15 shots and hit the target with all 15. More remarkably, 14 of her 15 hits were in the highest scoring zone, with one shot hitting just outside the center ring. Her accuracy with a moving target at 600 yards was better than most competitors had achieved with stationary targets at shorter distances. The range officer called for scoring, and the electronic target system immediately displayed Maria's results. The numbers appeared on the display board visible to all observers: 15 hits, 14 in the highest scoring zone, 1 in the second highest zone, total score 98 points out of 100. The silence that followed was complete and profound. For near-perfect scores, including a 98 on moving targets, represented a level of marksmanship that nobody had thought possible. Several observers were seen shaking their heads in disbelief, as if they could make the performance less extraordinary by refusing to accept what they had witnessed. Commander Morrison felt a strange mixture of awe and concern as he stared at Maria's final scores. Her overall performance represented not just victory, but domination of the competition at a level that seemed to belong to a different category of human capability. He realized that he would be writing reports and answering questions about this day for months to come. The final scores were announced officially.
Maria Santos, 398 points out of 400 possible. Petty Officer Johnson, 349 points. Staff Sergeant Williams, 317 points. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez, 312 points. The gap between first and second place was larger than the gap between second and eighth place.
As the competition concluded, Maria began packing her equipment with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout the day. She answered congratulations politely but briefly, showing no signs of excitement or surprise at her performance. To outside observers, she might have been completing a routine training exercise rather than achieving one of the greatest individual performances in military marksmanship history. Commander Morrison approached Maria as she finished packing her gear.
Staff Sergeant, I need to ask you something else. This performance today, is this normal for you, or did you have an exceptionally good day?
Maria considered the question while closing her rifle case. I suppose it was a pretty good day, sir. The conditions were favorable, and I felt comfortable with all the events. But I wouldn't say it was exceptional for me personally.
You wouldn't say it was exceptional?
Morrison's voice carried a note of disbelief. Santos, you just shot scores that will probably never be matched in military competition.
You're telling me this is normal for you?
I understand that the scores were unusual for this type of competition, sir. But the shooting itself felt pretty routine.
These are all shots I've made many times before.
Morrison stared at her for a long moment, trying to process the implications of what she was telling him. If this performance was routine for Maria, then her actual capabilities might be even more extraordinary than what they had witnessed today. As word of Maria's performance spread beyond the immediate range, reactions began pouring in from throughout the military community. Senior officers who had heard about the scores were already making phone calls, trying to verify that the reports weren't exaggerated. Military marksmanship instructors were reviewing the official score sheets, looking for some explanation for results that challenged everything they thought they knew about human shooting ability. Several competitors approached Maria to offer congratulations and ask questions about her background and training. Most were genuinely impressed and curious, but a few seemed skeptical about whether her performance could be legitimate. The idea that someone with her background and experience could outperform elite special operations personnel by such a wide margin was difficult for some people to accept.
Staff Sergeant Williams was among those who approached Maria with genuine respect and curiosity.
Santos, he said, I've been shooting competitively for over a decade, and I've never seen anything like what you did today.
I have to ask, have you ever considered trying out for special operations units? With your skills, you could probably qualify for any sniper program in the military. Maria looked up from her equipment bag.
I appreciate the suggestion, but I'm pretty happy with my current assignment. I get to do the shooting I enjoy, and I can still support my family the way I need to.
This response surprised Williams and several others who were listening.
Most military personnel with exceptional skills actively sought assignments that would challenge them and advance their careers. The idea that someone with Maria's abilities would be satisfied with a standard reconnaissance position was difficult to understand. What they didn't know was that Maria's priorities were different from most people in her situation. Her primary goal wasn't career advancement or recognition, it was earning enough money to support her family and eventually pay off the ranch. She had calculated exactly how much she needed to earn and how long it would take, and her current position provided a clear path to achieving those goals. Petty Officer Johnson approached Maria with a mixture of respect and professional curiosity. As the defending champion and an experienced SEAL sniper, he understood better than most others what Maria had accomplished. Santos, he said, I have to admit, you completely outclassed everyone here today. I've been shooting competitively for 8 years, and I've never seen scores like that.
Thank you, Maria replied.
You shot very well yourself, especially on the moving targets. Johnson appreciated her recognition of his performance, but he was more interested in understanding her background.
Can I ask where you plan to go from here?
I mean, with skills like yours, you could probably write your own ticket to any assignment you wanted. I'm planning to finish my current enlistment and, then, probably return to Texas to help run my family's ranch.
This response shocked Johnson and everyone else within hearing distance.
The idea that someone with Maria's extraordinary abilities would leave the military to work on a ranch seemed incomprehensible to people who understood how rare her skills were. Commander Morrison overheard this conversation and found himself struggling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he respected Maria's right to make her own career decisions. On the other hand, he felt that someone with her capabilities had an obligation to use those skills in service to the country, especially in an era when military snipers were in high demand for various missions around the world. "Staff Sergeant," Morrison said, "I hope you'll reconsider that plan. The military could use someone with your abilities in a lot of different capacities.
Have you ever thought about becoming an instructor? You could train the next generation of military marksmen." Maria considered this suggestion for a moment.
"I appreciate the offer, sir, but teaching has never really interested me.
I prefer to focus on my own shooting and supporting my unit's mission."
As the day concluded and participants began departing the range, Commander Morrison found himself alone with the score sheets and results that documented what he had witnessed. He knew that these results would generate interest from the highest levels of the military command structure. Shooting performance like Maria's didn't go unnoticed, especially in an era when precision marksman skills were increasingly important for military operations. But Morrison also understood that Maria Santos represented something more complex than just exceptional marksmanship. She embodied a different approach to military service, one focused on personal excellence and family responsibility rather than career advancement and recognition. Her priorities and motivations were refreshingly honest in a military culture that often emphasized achievement for its own sake. As Morrison locked the score sheets in his office safe, he reflected on what he had learned about leadership and excellence from watching Maria perform. Sometimes the most extraordinary capabilities came from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes the greatest achievements were accomplished by people who weren't seeking achievement at all. Maria Santos had shocked the military marksmanship community, but she had also reminded everyone present that true excellence often came from unexpected places and was motivated by purposes that went far beyond competition scores or professional recognition. Her performance would be remembered and discussed for years to come, but the woman behind the performance remained as much of a mystery as she had been when she first arrived at the range that morning. 3 weeks after the competition, Commander Morrison sat in his office reviewing after-action reports when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from the Pentagon, which immediately caught his attention. Calls from senior military leadership weren't routine for a training facility commander, especially ones that came with specific requests to discuss individual personnel.
"Commander Morrison, this is Colonel Patricia Hayes from Special Operations Command.
I understand you recently conducted a marksmanship competition that produced some extraordinary results." Morrison had been expecting this call since Maria's scores had been officially reported through military channels.
"Yes, ma'am.
We had a competitor achieve scores that I'd never seen before in 20 years of military service.
I've read the preliminary reports, Commander, and, frankly, they're hard to believe. Near-perfect scores across 4 different events, including moving targets at 600 yards? Are you certain these results are accurate?" "Absolutely certain, Colonel.
I witnessed the entire competition personally, and we have multiple observers who can verify every score."
Staff Sergeant Santos' performance was legitimate and documented according to standard competition protocols.
Colonel Hayes was quiet for a moment before continuing.
"Commander, I'm going to be direct with you. We have units that are in immediate need of sniper personnel with advanced capabilities.
Based on these scores, Staff Sergeant Santos appears to be exactly what we're looking for."
"Has anyone approached her about reassignment to special operations?"
Morrison had been anticipating this question as well. "Several people have mentioned special operations opportunities to her, ma'am, but she's indicated that she's satisfied with her current assignment and plans to complete her enlistment before returning to civilian life."
"Returning to civilian life? Commander, are you telling me that someone with these capabilities is planning to leave the military?"
"That's correct, Colonel. She wants to return to Texas to help run her family's ranch." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Morrison wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Colonel Hayes spoke again, her voice carrying a note of disbelief.
"Commander, I need you to arrange a meeting with Staff Sergeant Santos.
I want to speak with her personally about opportunities that might change her mind about leaving the service." Morrison agreed to arrange the meeting, but he suspected that Colonel Hayes would find Maria Santos to be as committed to her current plans as she had been to her shooting on competition day. Maria's priorities seemed to be based on something deeper than career advancement or professional recognition. Meanwhile, Maria was dealing with the unexpected attention that her performance had generated. Her unit commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Wright, had called her into his office to discuss the flood of inquiries he had been receiving about her assignment and availability for special operations training. "Santos," Wright said, I've gotten calls from 3 different special operations units in the past week, all wanting to know if you're available for immediate reassignment. I've also had requests from the Army Marksmanship Unit and 2 different sniper schools that want you as an instructor.
What do you want me to tell these people?
Maria sat across from Wright's desk, her expression calm and thoughtful. Sir, I appreciate the interest, but I'm satisfied with my current position. I joined the military to serve my country and support my family, and my current assignment allows me to do both effectively.
Wright studied her for a moment.
He had been Maria's commanding officer for 18 months and had always found her to be an exceptional soldier. Her shooting abilities had been known within the unit, but the competition results had revealed capabilities that went far beyond what anyone had realized.
Santos, I need to make sure you understand what you're turning down.
Some of these opportunities could advance your career significantly and provide experiences that most military personnel never get.
Are you certain you want to pass on all of them?
Yes, sir. My goals in the military are pretty specific, and my current assignment helps me achieve them effectively. Wright respected Maria's decision, but he also felt an obligation to ensure that she understood the full scope of what she was declining.
Can you help me understand your reasoning?
I mean, with your abilities, you could probably name your assignment anywhere in the military. Maria considered how to explain her priorities without revealing personal details that she preferred to keep private. Sir, I joined the military with specific financial goals for my family. My current assignment provides a clear path to achieving those goals within the time frame I've planned. The special operations opportunities would probably be interesting, but they wouldn't necessarily help me accomplish what I need to accomplish. This perspective struck Wright as both refreshingly honest and somewhat surprising. Most soldiers with exceptional abilities were motivated by opportunities for challenge, advancement, and recognition. Maria's focus on practical goals and family responsibilities represented a different approach to military service that Wright found himself respecting.
The meeting with Colonel Hayes took place the following week at the base conference facility.
Morrison introduced Maria to the colonel, then remained present as an observer while Hayes explained the opportunities available in special operations units.
Staff Sergeant Santos, Hayes began, your competition performance has generated significant interest throughout the special operations community. We have immediate openings for snipers with advanced capabilities in several high-priority units.
These assignments would provide advanced training, overseas deployment opportunities, and career advancement potential that goes far beyond what's available in conventional units.
Maria listened politely as Hayes detailed the various opportunities.
Special Forces sniper teams, SEAL platoons, Delta Force reconnaissance units, each assignment came with prestige, challenge, and opportunities that most military personnel could only dream about. Colonel, I appreciate you taking the time to explain these opportunities, Maria replied when Hayes finished. They sound like excellent assignments for people whose goals align with what special operations offers. But my personal goals are different, and my current assignment actually serves them better than these opportunities would.
Hayes leaned forward, clearly surprised by Maria's response. Santos, can you help me understand your goals? Because frankly, turning down opportunities like these suggests priorities that I'm having trouble understanding.
Maria considered how much to reveal about her family situation and financial motivations. Ma'am, I joined the military to serve my country and to earn enough money to help my family keep our ranch. My current assignment allows me to do both effectively, and I've calculated that completing my current enlistment will achieve my financial goals within the time frame I need.
And special operations assignments wouldn't achieve those same goals?
They might, ma'am, but they would also involve uncertainties and complications that could interfere with my plans. My current assignment provides predictability that works better for my situation.
Colonel Hayes stared at Maria for a long moment, trying to process this perspective.
In her experience, exceptional military personnel were typically motivated by opportunities for challenge and advancement. The idea that someone with Maria's abilities would prioritize predictability and family financial goals over special operations opportunities was difficult to understand.
Santos, I have to ask, do you realize how rare your shooting abilities are?
In my 25 years of military service, I've never seen performance scores like what you achieved in that competition. I understand that my scores were unusual for a military competition, ma'am. But the shooting itself felt routine for me. These are capabilities I've had since childhood, and I've never considered them particularly extraordinary. This response struck Hayes as either remarkable humility or complete lack of awareness about her own abilities.
Santos, extraordinary capabilities come with responsibilities. Don't you feel some obligation to use your skills in the most challenging and important assignments available?
Maria considered this question carefully before responding. Ma'am, I believe I'm using my skills effectively in my current assignment. I support my unit's mission, I serve my country, and I'm able to achieve my personal goals at the same time. I'm not sure how taking a different assignment would fulfill my responsibilities more effectively. Hayes realized that she was dealing with someone whose motivation and priorities were fundamentally different from what she was accustomed to in special operations personnel. Maria's focus on practical goals and family responsibilities represented a perspective that Hayes respected but found difficult to understand. The conversation concluded with Hayes expressing her disappointment but respecting Maria's decision. As Maria left the conference room, Hayes turned to Commander Morrison with a puzzled expression. Commander, in 25 years of recruiting for special operations, I've never had someone with capabilities like that turn down every opportunity we offered.
What's your assessment of her decision-making?
Morrison had been thinking about this question since the competition. Colonel, I think Staff Sergeant Santos knows exactly what she wants and why she wants it. Her priorities are different from most people with her capabilities, but they seem to be based on solid reasoning and personal values that she's not willing to compromise.
And you think she'll actually follow through on leaving the military?
Based on everything I've observed about her, yes ma'am. She strikes me as someone who makes decisions carefully and sticks with them regardless of external pressure. As news of Maria's decision to decline special operations opportunities spread through military channels, reactions varied widely.
Some senior officers expressed frustration that such exceptional capabilities would be wasted in conventional assignments.
Others admired her commitment to personal goals and family responsibilities.
Within Maria's own unit, the reaction was more uniformly positive.
Soldiers who had served with her appreciated that she was choosing to remain with them rather than seeking more prestigious assignments. Her decision reinforced the unit's morale and demonstrated that exceptional people could find satisfaction in conventional military roles. Lieutenant Colonel Wright called Maria into his office again after learning about her meeting with Colonel Hayes.
Santos, I understand you turned down some pretty significant opportunities. Are you certain you're making the right decision?
Yes, sir. The opportunities were impressive, but they don't align with my personal goals and timeline. Wright nodded, having expected this response.
Well, I want you to know that the unit appreciates your decision to stay with us.
Your skills and professionalism make everyone around you better, and we're fortunate to have you. This recognition meant more to Maria than Wright probably realized. She had joined the military not for career advancement or recognition, but to serve effectively while achieving specific personal goals. Knowing that her service was valued in her current assignment confirmed that she was making the right choice. 6 months later, Maria received news that would validate her priorities in a way she hadn't expected. Her family called to tell her that the ranch's financial situation had improved significantly due to the money she had been sending home, combined with better cattle prices and a successful hunting season. For the first time in years, the ranch was generating enough income to support itself without depending on her military pay.
This news presented Maria with options she hadn't anticipated.
She could now consider staying in the military beyond her original enlistment timeline, or she could return to the ranch earlier than planned knowing that her family was financially secure. Either way, she had achieved the primary goal that had motivated her military service. As Maria considered these options, she reflected on the path that had brought her to this point. Her exceptional shooting abilities had opened doors she had never sought, generated opportunities that most people would consider once-in-a-lifetime chances, and attracted attention from the highest levels of military leadership. But, through it all, she had remained focused on her original goals and values. She had used her abilities to serve her country effectively while supporting her family's financial needs. She had achieved recognition and respect without compromising her principles or changing her priorities. The competition that had revealed her extraordinary capabilities had also revealed something equally important about her character. Maria Santos was someone who could achieve the seemingly impossible while remaining grounded in the values and relationships that defined her identity. Commander Morrison often reflected on the day he had witnessed Maria's historic performance.
The score she achieved would be remembered in military marksmanship circles for decades to come.
But Morrison found himself thinking more often about the person behind those scores, someone who had demonstrated that exceptional capabilities could coexist with humility, that extraordinary achievement could be motivated by simple family love, and that the most impressive performances sometimes came from people who weren't seeking to impress anyone. Years later, when Morrison told the story of Maria's competition performance, he always emphasized the same point. The most remarkable thing about that day wasn't the scores she achieved, but the fact that those scores were accomplished by someone who remained completely unchanged by the achievement. Maria Santos had shocked the military world with her shooting, but she had taught everyone who witnessed it something more important about excellence, humility, and staying true to your values regardless of external recognition. The question, who just took that shot, had been answered definitively. But the more important question, who was the person behind that shot, revealed a story that was far more inspiring than any competition score could ever be. Maria Santos had proven that the most extraordinary capabilities often belong to the most ordinary people, and that the greatest achievements were often motivated by the simplest and most powerful force of all, love for family.